Hello and welcome to Mothman's Bookshop. My name is Nicole, and today we're talking about the limits of a genre. Warning, I'll try and make this as spoiler-free as possible, but given it's a book review, there are bound to be a couple spoilers. Now, we all know and love the shopkeep, aka me, but let's welcome our new guest, the Archivist.
Hello, my name is Tobias, the Archivist here at Mothman's Bookshop. I've been working here for 27 odd years, yet have never spoken.
Fascinating.
Ever since Moth found me on the side of the road, I've been given stable employment.
And tell us, what has it been like working here at Mothman's Bookshop?
Every day is such a treat. It's great to see so many faces get so many good stories.
And with all that said and done, this is Literary Limits. Now, you may have heard me mention Literary Limits in the last episode, and here it is, the show where Tobias and I talk about all sorts of literary things, mostly literary discourse. This episode, limits of a genre and genre overlap. How far does a genre go? What defines a genre? And other things. Let's get into it. To start off, what is your favorite genre, Toby?
So I really happen to like mystery books, but a favorite of mine is historical fiction, though.
Do you have a favorite book in that genre, or?
One of my favorite series is The 39 Clues, such a great young adult series.
Nice. My personal favorite genre, as you might have heard in my previous episode of Genre Guild, is magical realism. I just think there's so much potential with that genre, and there are so many different books under that umbrella. And that sort of brings us into our discussion today of what defines the limits of a genre. We all know what defines a genre itself, such as with magical realism, we have authorial reticence and character tropes, but how far can we take that?
What exactly defines the edges of it? Because you will have books like Harry Potter, for example, which doesn't fit neatly into that magical realism.
Definitely, yeah. You have a lot more fantasy elements in Harry Potter, such as, unicorns, werewolves. I mean, the wizarding world is entirely hidden away. So some of the articles I was reading definitely said that Harry Potter stretches those limits. My mother mentioned while we were talking about the episode that folktales could definitely be considered part of magical realism because at some point they were realistic, but with magical elements, wouldn't you say?
I mean, that comes with the oral folk history of everything, passing it from one mouth to another. Things get embellished, things get added.
Absolutely.
And I think that's part of storytelling as a whole.
Oh, definitely, definitely. I mean, if you look at a lot of historical tales, like with Hercules, for example, you have tales that parallel wars of the time or the Iliad and the Odyssey. You have those recounting tales of war between Rome and Greece or between Greece and within kingdoms within Greece. So definitely a lot of embellishing happens when you look at magical realism.
A lot of embellishing, a lot of borrowing takes place during this time. It's very hard to just define something as a given genre.
Yeah, it's hard to set limits on art. And that goes for any art, not just literature or traditional art. I think music as well. You can really look at certain songs and think, hey, what umbrellas can these be categorized? What umbrellas can these go into?
It's very limiting for any work of art, like you were saying, to just box something in as one genre, one type of music, anything like that. It should be taken sort of as a work in and of itself.
Absolutely.
Really.
Absolutely. One of the things I also wanted to talk about was genre overlap, which is, I think, its own conversation because, like we're talking about here, we have things that can belong under multiple umbrellas. But when does one piece fully cross over from one type of genre to another?
Well, I think you have the case of like mixed genres books where one book goes in to two different genres. I think you would have to have a predominantly one genre type of book. Do you have any good examples of something like that?
I would love to talk about actually Frankenstein because you have a realistic setting, which is Germany, Italy, the Swiss mountains, and then you also have this monster roaming around. To begin with, we all know that Frankenstein is considered the sort of birthplace of modern science fiction, but can it also be considered magical realism in some way?
In a sense, it is a European adaptation of it. You are taking aspects of the real world, counts, dukes, scientists, and you're throwing in this unnatural bringing of life. It takes inspiration from several tales like we were talking earlier. how Hercules borrowed, Frankenstein does borrow from some very mythical and ancient tales. Brings it to a more modern setting, at least for the time.
Definitely,
And I
yeah.
think it makes something new out of an existing genre.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that Frankenstein does is, like with magical realism, which I keep bringing up, it comments on society, it comments on politics, on religion. It plays with that idea of, can we as humans play this metaphorical god, like Dr. Frankenstein does?
It also deals a lot with the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean? Or should we trust everything out there? Or is it like Frankenstein's monster where it is innately good?
So, would you classify Frankenstein as purely science fiction, or is it one of those weird gray area mixed genre books?
I think based on the definitions of what science fiction is, it has some overlap, but I think primarily it is a science fiction and the first science fiction book. Mary Shelley is a brilliant author who wrote that at only age 17, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And she pioneered things like Orson Welles and all sorts of just phenomenal writers. I definitely think it is purely a science fiction book.
And I definitely see that. Speaking of Orson Welles, I think dystopia is coming into play. I think that was his focus, and George Orwell, right? That's who I'm thinking of.
Separate author, but yes.
But yeah, I just thought of this. But George Orwell, is that purely dystopia? Because sometimes you look at things like Animal Farm, where you have, I believe, talking animals. I've never read the book. Is this a dystopia or is it magical realism?
He is a multi-genre author for sure. George Orwell wrote 1984, which would be the classical dystopian.
Absolutely.
But it also says something about our world today as more of a fiction in a far-flung future.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to extrapolate that as to it is a fiction instead of just a dystopian fiction, sure. As for the Animal Farm, I think it's sort of magical realism, which tells us the tale of today and of the past. When he was writing about that specifically, he was writing about the uprisings taking place in specifically France and Russia.
I did not know that.
He plays it off in a form of a children's story almost.
Mm-hmm. When you mentioned 1984, you mentioned this idea of the far-flung future. And I wanted to ask, are dystopias purely futuristic, or can they be set in the present/past?
There are a few examples of former dystopias or utopias as well. Mm-hmm. The idea of the dystopian has been around for forever, even since the Garden of Eden. That is your idea of a utopia. Everything is perfect. A dystopia is a utopia on the surface, but things are not as perfect as it seems. There's something underlying there. This is all just human nature. Do we trust ourselves? Do we trust a higher power? Do we trust anything to make the world perfect? Does perfect exist?
Oh, the idea that does perfect exist is a whole different conversation. That's a very fun conversation to have. Oh, perfection. But yeah, I think you bring up a good point that we can bring up the Garden of Eden in conversations of utopias and dystopias, because even with the Garden of Eden, where you have everything seemingly perfect, you still have that tempting apple. Was it the apple of knowledge that Eve eventually bites into, and boom, utopia shattered. Now you have maybe even a dystopia because you have Adam and Eve being kicked out of the seemingly perfect garden.
Sort of, but with stuff like that, dystopias, utopias, are they a genre in and of themselves, though, or are they just a trope in many genres?
I would say that dystopias are a genre in and of itself. However, I do want to argue that utopias are more of a trope. Dystopias are a genre, but utopias are a trope within that genre.
I see. Some of my favorite dystopian novels, like Ender's Game, for example, where it's a very futuristic society and people think nothing's wrong. Children are just playing a game, but you're actually taking out civilizations.
Yeah, you have children being trained in these boot camps and sending them to essentially war.
Yes. And then another classic dystopian young adults novel is Maze Runner.
Oh, a classic. Absolutely. Or Hunger Games. Yeah.
Yes.
Hunger Games is under that category where you have, does it go? the lower levels are the better ones, or is it the upper levels that are
I
the better
believe
ones?
closer to the capital.
That's yeah, yeah. And where you have this seemingly perfect society, but then as you go to these outer rings, it gets worse and worse.
That has also some roots in historical fiction, I believe. Just different caste systems, and Hunger Games borrows from that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about that wealth inequality as well.
Mm-hmm. That is a big part of dystopias, now that I think of it, wealth inequality. Yeah. Like in 1984, definitely, or, well, like you said, Hunger Games, that's a big trope, is wealth inequality. I haven't met many dystopias, but one of the ones that I really liked is actually the first episode of this podcast, The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. She's a Japanese author, and The Memory Police is a Japanese book, of course. But it's about this sort of society where things go missing, and then the people slowly forget that these things ever existed, except there are a couple people that can still retain these sort of memories. So that's something to think about.
I think the more important question for today, though, is where do you draw the lines in certain books or in certain genres to define one from another?
Yeah, we got a little bit off topic, but that is the topic of the day, so to speak. I think where I draw the line is where tropes from one genre are more plentiful or overtake the tropes from another genre.
Do you have a good example of that?
So I had to think about that for a second, but I do want to bring utopias up again, because I really think that utopias are, if not purely, then majority a dystopian genre trope, because you don't see utopias that often in other genres like historical fiction, or I want to even say fantasy books. I really can't think of a time where I found this idea of a utopia surface level.
I would have to actually disagree.
Oh?
If you're looking at particularly fantasy books or folktale, an idea of a heaven or an elvish realm, in the case of Lord of the Rings, where everything's seeming to be perfect, there might be something on the outskirts of that utopia that is threatening. But I don't know that a utopia is just in a dystopian fantasy.
I actually didn't think of that. The sort of elvish realm or the heaven and hell idea in certain books as being that utopia. That's a really good point.
There's also, I think, part of that trope as well. For example, Percy Jackson, when they get trapped in the Lotus Casino, it seems to be a utopia, but in actuality is a trap.
That's a really good point. I can't believe I didn't think of that. This is why we have you on the show, my dear Archivist.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, you know what? Now that I think of it, since I don't have utopias anymore, off the top of my head, I can't really think of a trope that purely belongs to one genre or another.
So then how do we actually classify a genre as opposed to it being a different genre?
There are certain things that belong to one genre or another that aren't necessarily tropes or maybe archetypes that we can point to just at random, but
I think style of writing is a good example of that.
Yes.
If I were to read something from a romance novel and it was written with fantasy elements in it, that would be a little strange. I think if you're looking at a nice romance novel, it has the style of it as well. I think that plays into a genre.
Yeah, you have not only individual author writing styles, but you also have these general styles of genre writing. Like, you can't look at a horror novel and be unsure whether it's horror or romance, like you said.
Or the grandiose speaking and world building behind fantasy as well.
Yeah, I can't really look at a fantasy book with all of its fascinating creatures and worlds and go, yes, sci-fi. I don't. And same with sci-fi. I don't think I can look at Frankenstein and go, this looks like a dystopia to me.
I also want to bring up a new topic based on Frankenstein specifically. Can genres evolve over time?
Absolutely, 100%.
And what happens if it gets so far removed that it becomes almost irrecognizable? Because I believe many folk tales started off as their own genres at one point.
I think the best example that we have of that are actually epics, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or famously the Poetic Edda from Iceland or Scandinavia. And they also have sagas, which are more sort of long-form family history works that recount the tales of their, uncles and grandfathers, but with a couple gods sprinkled here or there for flourish. But that sort of brings up the question of, have these tales morphed into folk tales from what they once were, or have they become something new entirely?
Sort of how we do with music, we all group old music into a genre of classical music.
Mm-hmm.
What that was in the current, well, when it was first produced,
Mm-hmm.
that might have been called pop music or a different genre entirely that is now lost to us.
Yeah, some of that classical music categorization that I think we can bring up is things like Rococo or Baroque, which are usually only applied to clothing or architecture styles, but we can also apply that to music. And that's something good to bring up about literature as well, is we currently group a lot of these tales as sagas or epics, but when do we separate, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh from family sagas of Iceland?
Like, there has been such a passes of time since our first written works.
Mm-hmm.
However, I don't know that there has been as many written works as you would think. There have been so many more songs written and so many more just different iterations of architecture that have already been going through. Yet I don't believe that there have been as many books written in the span of human history that we have gotten to the point where we can categorize them by age quite yet.
That's a really good point, because when you look at things, you have things like song, and you have things like time knots or beating, such as the Native Americans used to tell stories and to keep track of things. And they've been along much longer than written language.
I do have another question that just came to mind. As opposed to genre, are there other ways we can classify books?
Like, what do you have an example of what you mean?
I do. Like how we classify by author. Like the works of Shakespeare always seem to go together.
Well, within Shakespeare, you also have his tragedies, comedies, and historical works. So I will argue with you on that, just because I am a nerd.
I do think it is a valid way of categorizing books, however, is by author. That is another way, like we do genres. It's just a method of categorization.
I actually think an author that you can bring up that would be someone that we classify books by is Stephen King.
And why is
A
that?
lot of his, if you look at it, a lot of his books are of a certain type of psychological thriller. Horror books, like Pet Sematary, you have
The Shining.
The Shining, of course. So I think he's one of the few authors that you can really look to and say that you can classify his books as being the books of Stephen King.
All because they're one genre?
I'd say the majority of them, yeah. Yeah, I can't really think of a famous Stephen King book and go, hey, that's a comedy.
Fair enough. I was just talking about other methods of classification in general.
I hear you.
But you do raise a valid point. Some authors give so much to just one particular genre, like R.L. Stine and Stephen King for horror. Do you have any other great examples of authors that are primarily one genre?
I'd go with Terry Pratchett. He is so huge on that raunchy, comedic sort of fantasy genre that I want to bring up. I think he has done a lot of work into expanding that genre, especially with his Discworld series and his continuation with working with Terry Pratchett on Good Omens, which is another favorite of mine, which is also this magical realism book. I'd say, yeah, he put a lot of work into the fantasy genre, the like comedic fantasy genre, and probably actually Tolkien. Tolkien is a big fantasy author. I can't really think of any of his other works of other genres.
That just sort of brings up how we were talking earlier, that there are authors that simply just define genres, like J.R.R. Tolkien, Mary Shelley, R.L. Stine. And I think just as more people get access to writing materials and write for themselves, that they'll get their fingers into these genres as well and help morph and shape them. The tropes we might have today might be unrecognizable 10, 20, even 100 years from now.
Absolutely. No, I agree 100%. I just thought of something that I feel like is definitely applicable to what are the limits of a genre? Fan fiction.
Oh.
Yeah, Toby. Fan fiction. We have things like AO3, like Wattpad, and you have some things that are just little scribbles on paper that people might come up with, or you have these incredible long-form works like things based off the Twilight Zone that some people may know of.
That brings up...
Or not the Twilight Zone, I'm sorry, the Twilight.
Yeah, I was going to say, Twilight initially started out as a fanfic.
Yeah.
No, I believe 50 Shades started out
as... it started off as a Twilight fanfic, and now we have what we know as the 50 Shades of Grey franchise.
Now, what exactly stops something from being fan fiction into an actual genre? Or is fan fiction an applicable genre or something of its own?
Well, that's something I wanted to bring up is we have fan fiction, and I think one of the biggest thing that, of course, separates fan fiction from other things is the usage of characters from another franchise. Like, in Twilight, you don't really have, or in 50 Shades of Grey, you don't really have the main characters named the same as the main characters of Twilight, but what you do have is different genres within fan fiction, which is what I really want to talk about, is you have so many different types. I mean, think of the tags on AO3, but... You have so many different types of fanfiction. So that's what I wanted to ask. Do we classify fanfiction as one genre, or do we think about the individual categories under it?
That's interesting. Is fanfiction an actual genre, or is it sort of an umbrella term or even a subgenre to describe different aspects of something? I think it's very similar to fiction. For example, you could use that as an umbrella term for a lot of things. Mm-hmm. You have science fiction, historical fiction.
Literary fiction.
Yes, all sorts of different things. Nonfiction as well has their own sort of tier chart like that.
Yeah. So what do we think about the different categories in fan fiction? So do we have one-shots? Do we have fanfics where the main character is, the classic YN?
I feel like there is definitely some overlap with existing standardized genres in fan fiction. I don't think you can necessarily separate that and call it its own thing.
I agree.
But it's definitely more a subgenre where something is already a work of a particular genre, but it's also a fan fiction because it borrows story elements, plots, characters.
So what you're doing is you're making fan fiction a subgenre rather than a genre itself.
Sort of, yeah.
I see that.
I believe it's harder to make fan fiction an umbrella term as it is applied to so many different works.
I see that, and I do agree with you. I think that the best way to think about it is to make fanfiction a subgenre that applies to a bunch of different things that fall under other genres.
So now that we've sort of classified fanfiction as a subgenre, there has to be other genres, specific subgenres, do you think?
I really can't think of many off the top of my head, but I had a thought about that, where we can use your typical, everyday genre classifications as subgenre classifications. You could say dystopias with a romance subgenre. You can say romance with a fantasy subgenre, or you can even say fantasy with a romance subgenre with Court of Thorn and Roses, I think it's called. I think that's a big one in the area. I think we can really use your typical everyday genres as subgenre titles as well.
I really think genres just help classify a work to let you know as the reader, what are you into?
Absolutely, yeah. I think as humans, we've grown very comfortable with labels. Just like in food labels, just so you know what you're expecting. Genres, no matter how objective they may be, I think genres are, once again, another type of label that just helps us feel better about what we intake as humans.
I 100% agree. And just like with any label, there are things that fit outside of it. This isn't a rigid system. I think it's open to reader interpretation. And that's what I love about literature.
Absolutely. We have covered so many amazing topics today, so I think this is the perfect place to leave this episode. Thank you so much, Tobias, for joining me. Any closing remarks?
Well, thank you for having me. I'll get back to my archives, saving endangered books and whatnot.
Sounds like a fun time. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Mothman's Bookshop. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this and would like to know when the next episode comes out, do yourself a favor and follow the podcast. And if you have any questions or recommendations, feel free to use the form in the description or join the Discord. Once again, my name is Nicole, and I'll see you next week here in Mothman's Bookshop.